When I first bought the little cabin by the lake, I thought I was stepping into a peaceful dream. The water stretched out behind the property like a mirror of the sky, calm and unbothered, ringed by tall pines that whispered when the wind moved through them. To me, that lake wasn't just water. It was freedom. I could cast a line whenever I wanted, paddle out in the old aluminum boat that came with the property, and breathe air that wasn't choked with the noise of city life. I'd spent years in the city, boxed in by traffic, deadlines, and the constant thrum of a world that never slowed down. This place, by contrast, felt timeless. Every ripple of water, every bird call in the distance, reminded me why I'd worked so hard to get here. I wasn't chasing luxury or prestige. I wanted quiet, solitude, and the simple joy of fishing on. A Saturday morning without anyone telling me I was breaking some invisible rule. What I didn't realize was that the lake wasn't just mine to enjoy. It sat in the middle of a community run by a homeowners association. At first, that didn't bother me. I'd dealt with HOAs before. Annoying, sure, overbearing, sometimes. But I'd learned to keep my head down and follow the rules. This one, however, was different. This HOA wasn't just about lawns and fences. They saw themselves as owners of the lake itself. The very first time I cast a fishing line from the dock, trouble began brewing. It was early morning. The fog clung low over the water, giving everything a ghostly haze. I carried my rod down to the dock, heart pounding with the kind of excitement only a new beginning can give. I baited the hook, flicked the rod forward, and watched the line arc gracefully before landing with a soft plunk. The stillness of the lake seemed to welcome me. Minutes later, the line tugged. A bass, not big but lively, thrashed as I reeled it in. I laughed out loud, not just at the catch, but at the feeling. Pure, childlike happiness. But before I could even take a photo, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure was striding down the path along the shoreline, purposeful, stern. It was a woman in her mid-50s, sunglasses perched like armor, clipboard in hand. Even from a distance, her body language radiated authority. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge the fish dangling from my line. Instead, she stopped at the edge of my property, lifted her chin, and introduced herself as the HOA president. Her words weren't a welcome. They were a warning. Fishing, she explained, was prohibited without HOA approval. She rattled off bylaws and restrictions as if she had memorized them, peppering the air with phrases like unauthorized activity and subject to fines. I thought she was joking at first. I had bought this property, fair and square, and the lake was literally behind my cabin. But the icy certainty in her voice left no room for humor. I nodded, feigned politeness, and thought to myself, what harm could fishing do? Surely they had bigger problems than me catching a couple of bass. I dismissed her and cast again, deciding her words weren't worth spoiling my morning. That decision lit the fuse. The first letter came within the week. An official-looking envelope stuffed into my mailbox, complete with HOA letterhead and stern wording. It cited unauthorized recreational activity and threatened fines. 2 days later, another arrived. Then another. Each one escalated. Higher fines, talk of legal action, demands to attend a disciplinary hearing. I ignored them. I figured they were bluffing, that the HOA couldn't actually dictate what I did with the water behind my property. But the president was relentless. She patrolled the lake like a hawk, clipboard always at the ready, documenting every moment I spent with a rod in hand. And the accusations grew stranger. One letter claimed I was polluting the water by fishing. Another said I was endangering the delicate ecosystem. My favorite was the one accusing me of lowering property values through unsanctioned behavior. According to her, me sitting on a dock with a fishing pole was somehow tanking the neighborhood's worth. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so persistent. Then one morning I noticed something off. I walked down to the dock expecting the usual crisp reflection of trees on the water, but instead, the lake looked wrong, murky, tinted with a strange greenish film that clung to the shoreline. A sour chemical smell hung in the air, sharp enough to sting my nose. And floating near the shore were fish, dozens of them, dead. Their bodies bobbed lifelessly against the dock, scales catching the morning light like shattered glass. My stomach sank. The HOA president appeared later that day, clipboard swapped for a pair of rubber boots. But instead of concern, she wore a smug little smile. She informed me that the lake had been treated to control invasive species and algae growth. According to her, the chemicals were harmless in small doses. She even claimed the die-off was normal, part of the process. But I wasn't buying it. The timing was too neat. I had been fishing. They wanted me to stop. Suddenly, the lake was poisoned. It didn't feel like maintenance. It felt like sabotage. A warning meant for me. I considered calling the county environmental office right then, but something told me to wait, to dig deeper. And the more I looked, the more disturbing the truth became. Because this lake wasn't just a pretty feature for homeowners. It wasn't just for kayaking or weekend barbecues. It was the community's water supply. That was the HOA's dirty little secret. Behind their talk of preservation and bylaws, they were playing with the very resource every homeowner depended on for drinking water. At first, I thought it was negligence, that they hadn't realized the consequences of dumping chemicals into the source of their own water. But the documents I found told a different story. They knew. They had been using treatments for years, covering it up with language about lake health. And now, in their zeal to stop me from fishing, they had gone too far. Standing on that dock with dead fish at my feet and the chemical stench rising off the water, I made a choice. I wouldn't let them bully me into submission. This wasn't about fines anymore. It wasn't about fishing either. It was about exposing what they had done, about holding them accountable for poisoning the lake and themselves. What the HOA president didn't realize was simple. She thought the lake gave her power, but in truth, it was about to become her greatest weakness. The image of dead fish drifting against my dock haunted me long after that morning. No matter how many times I tried to shake it off, the memory clung like the chemical smell that hung over the water. Every time I walked past the shoreline, the green film shimmering across its surface seemed to whisper the same question. What have they done? The HOA wanted me to see it as an inconvenience, a minor side effect of their so-called lake treatment. But I knew better. Water doesn't lie. Fish don't die en masse unless something is seriously wrong. And I couldn't ignore the fact that the timing aligned perfectly with their campaign against me. The thing is, the HOA probably assumed I'd give up, pack away my rod, and accept their rules. What they didn't expect was that I had time, patience, and an ability they lacked: persistence. If they wanted to play games, I was prepared to play longer, dig deeper, and bring their secrets into the light. So I started watching. At first, it was simple observation. Every morning, I'd sit by the dock with a cup of coffee and note what I saw. Trucks arriving at odd hours. Men unloading barrels into the maintenance shed near the shoreline. The same group of HOA board members gathering like clockwork every Friday night at the clubhouse. Their meetings always closed door, their voices hushed. I also started paying attention to my neighbors. Many of them waved politely, exchanged pleasantries, and seemed eager to avoid conflict. But there were signs of unease if you looked close enough. A mother filling water jugs at the community well, glancing over her shoulder like she didn't want to be seen. An older man with a collection of water filters stacked in his garage, clearly preparing for something he wouldn't say out loud. And kids scratching at rashes after swimming in the shallows. The HOA had built a culture of silence. People didn't talk about problems because they didn't want fines, retaliation, or worse, social exile from the community. But silence doesn't erase truth. It just buries it until someone determined enough comes along with a shovel. That someone was me. I began documenting everything. Photos of dead fish, dated and timed. Notes on water clarity, smell, and any visible changes. Records of trucks, license plates, and the barrels I saw moved into storage. Every detail mattered, and I kept it all in a binder that grew heavier with each passing week. Still, I needed proof beyond my own observations. Proof that could stand against the HOA's inevitable denials. So I took the next step. I collected water samples. It felt strange, crouching at the edge of the dock with glass jars in hand, scooping liquid that looked far less innocent than it should. The water was cloudy, flecked with particles that didn't belong, and when I held it to the light, it caught the sun in an unnatural sheen. I sent the samples to a local lab under the guise of a curious homeowner concerned about algae. The results came back within a week, and they were worse than I'd imagined. Elevated levels of copper sulfate, pesticides, and traces of chemicals that had no business being in a natural body of water. Copper sulfate alone can kill fish when misused. But combined with the other substances present, it was clear the lake hadn't just been treated, it had been bombed. Someone had intentionally dumped a cocktail of toxins into it, either out of ignorance or spite. My blood boiled. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. They had jeopardized an ecosystem, poisoned a water source, and put the health of every family in this community at risk, all to make a point. All to control me. But here's where things got complicated. The HOA wasn't stupid. They had lawyers, connections, and a fortress of bylaws to shield them. Marching into a meeting and waving the lab results in their faces would only get me painted as a troublemaker, maybe even sanctioned. I needed strategy, not rage. So I kept quiet, at least outwardly. When neighbors asked how I was settling in, I smiled and said everything was fine. When the HOA president walked by with her clipboard and fake smile, I tipped my hat and wished her a good day. I became the image of compliance, the man who had finally fallen in line. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I built my case, I researched the lake's history, digging through county records that showed how it had been designated a shared water supply decades ago. I found permits that clearly outlined restrictions on chemical treatments. I even located a study conducted 5 years back warning against overuse of copper sulfate due to the risk of contamination. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a damning picture. The HOA had not only violated regulations, they had done so knowingly, repeatedly, and arrogantly. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. If I truly wanted to stop them, I needed allies. That's when I started talking to neighbors more directly. Not in groups, never in groups, because fear thrives in crowds. Instead, I spoke one-on-one, quietly, carefully. To the mother filling water jugs, I shared my lab results and asked if her kids' rashes had appeared after swimming. To the older man with the filters, I admitted I had the same concerns and showed him what the samples revealed. At first, they were hesitant. Fear of retaliation lingered in their eyes. But as the weeks passed, I found more who were willing to whisper what they had seen. Coughs that wouldn't go away, pets that had fallen sick, odd tastes in the tap water. The HOA's control was cracking, one neighbor at a time. Of course, the president noticed. She wasn't blind. She saw the way people lingered at my dock, the quiet conversations over fences, the way smiles shifted when she walked by. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, she appeared uninvited at my cabin door. Her words were coated in honey but carried the weight of a threat. She told me she hoped I was enjoying my new life here, and reminded me how important it was to maintain harmony in the community. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned how easily misunderstandings could spiral into lawsuits, fines, and even foreclosures. I smiled, nodded, and closed the door as politely as I could. But inside, I felt the fire grow hotter. She knew I was onto them, and instead of backing down, she was doubling her intimidation. Good. That meant I was getting close. The truth was no longer a secret I held alone. It was spreading quietly but steadily, like cracks in a dam. The HOA wanted silence, but silence was slipping through their fingers, and as I sat on my dock that night, binder of evidence at my side, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about me or my fishing rights anymore. It was about every family who drank from this lake, every child who swam in its shallows, every neighbor too afraid to speak. The HOA thought they had control because they had rules, fines, and power. But the one thing they couldn't control was the truth. And the truth was about to come crashing down on them harder than they ever imagined. The HOA president must have thought her visit to my cabin would scare me into silence. That's how these people usually operated. Intimidation, veiled threats, the weight of authority pressed down until resistance crumbled. Maybe it had worked on others before me, but all it did was confirm what I already knew. They were hiding something dangerous, and they were desperate to keep it buried. After that night, my focus sharpened. Every action I took was deliberate, every move calculated. I wasn't just a man with a fishing pole anymore. I was a witness, a collector of evidence, and whether the HOA liked it or not, their empire was about to start crumbling. I began attending their monthly board meetings, not to speak, not yet, but to listen. They held them in the clubhouse, a log-style building overlooking the lake, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and polished wood floors meant to impress newcomers. On the surface, the meetings were tame. They talked about lawn care, dues, pool maintenance. They praised themselves for keeping the neighborhood prestigious. But every so often I caught glimpses of the cracks. One member would bring up concerns about the water's color. Another would mention complaints from parents about children getting rashes. Each time, the president would cut them off, brush the matter aside, or drown it beneath a flood of unrelated talking points. It was subtle but obvious to anyone paying attention. She didn't want those conversations on record. I made notes of everything. Who spoke, who got silenced, and how often water quality came up only to be buried. My binder grew heavier still, not just with lab results and photographs, but with transcripts of their deliberate avoidance. Meanwhile, my quiet conversations with neighbors continued. A retired nurse confessed to me that she suspected the sudden spike in stomach illnesses around the community wasn't coincidence. A young father admitted he had started buying bottled water in bulk because his tap smelled off. And then there was the man who lived 2 houses down, who said his dog had died after drinking straight from the lake, a detail that shook me more than I wanted to admit. The more I listened, the clearer it became. People were afraid, but their fear was shifting. It was no longer just fear of the HOA's wrath. It was fear of what was happening in their own homes, through their own faucets. The HOA president must have sensed it too, because her tactics escalated. One morning I woke up to find a violation notice taped to my door, accusing me of unauthorized structural modifications. Apparently, leaving a tackle box on my dock now qualified as a violation. Another week, they claimed my mailbox was non-compliant with community standards, even though it was identical to every other mailbox on the street. It was petty, transparent harassment meant to grind me down, but each notice only added fuel to my determination. I kept them all, filed neatly alongside the rest of my evidence, each one another brick in the wall I was building against them. Then came the turning point. It was late on a Friday evening when I noticed unusual activity near the maintenance shed. From my dock, I saw headlights bobbing through the trees, the sound of an engine cut off quickly, as if whoever was driving didn't want to draw attention. I watched as 2 men in reflective vests unloaded barrels, large blue industrial barrels, and rolled them into the shed. Curiosity burned in me like wildfire. I waited until they were gone, then slipped into the woods and approached the shed under cover of darkness. The door was padlocked, but the faint chemical smell wafting through the cracks was enough to confirm my suspicions. This was where the poison came from. The next morning, I brought my camera. From a distance, I captured photos of the barrels through a gap in the wood. I zoomed in until the labels were legible. Copper sulfate, algicide, herbicides, chemicals not meant to be mixed, certainly not dumped carelessly into a lake. The sight made my skin crawl. It was one thing to suspect the HOA of reckless behavior. It was another to see the proof with my own eyes, but proof alone doesn't win battles. Timing does, strategy does, and I wasn't ready to play my full hand yet. Instead, I doubled down on subtlety. I kept showing up to meetings, kept smiling at neighbors, kept acting like the man who had adjusted to the HOA's way of life. All the while, I was laying the groundwork for something bigger, because what the HOA president didn't realize was that every moment she tried to tighten her grip, more people slipped through her fingers. I wasn't the only one noticing the change in the water, the illnesses, the odd smells. Whispers were spreading, quiet at first, then louder, weaving through backyard fences and late-night porch conversations. The community's trust was breaking, and then, almost like fate, an opportunity fell right into my lap. The county announced they would be conducting routine water quality checks across several rural communities, ours included. It wasn't unusual. These checks happened every few years, but the timing couldn't have been more perfect. I knew if the inspectors tested the lake, the truth would come spilling out. The HOA president, however, also knew at the next board meeting, she made a show of welcoming the inspection while quickly moving to establish that the HOA would facilitate all communication with the county. In other words, they would control access, guide inspectors only where they wanted them to look, and ensure no awkward questions were asked. I sat quietly in the back, but inside, I was grinning. She thought she could stage manage the truth. She didn't realize I had already armed myself with evidence far stronger than any performance she could orchestrate. Still, I couldn't risk leaving it to chance. If the inspectors only tested at one location, they might miss the worst contamination. So I decided to make sure the right samples were seen. The night before the county's visit, I collected fresh water from the most tainted parts of the lake, the shallows where the green film gathered thickest, the spot near the shed where runoff pooled after rains. I labeled the jars carefully, dated them, and stored them in a cooler. When the inspectors arrived the next morning, I was there. I greeted them like a curious homeowner, asked polite questions, and when the moment was right, I casually offered the samples I had gathered. I framed it as helpful, explaining that I had noticed strange odors and fish kills and thought they might want a broader set of data points. The inspectors accepted the jars without hesitation. The HOA president, standing nearby with her ever-present clipboard, stiffened. For the first time, I saw genuine fear flash across her face. That was the moment I knew. The dam was about to break. But breaking dams isn't clean. It's violent. It sweeps away everything in its path, innocent and guilty alike. And as much as I wanted justice, I also knew this was just the beginning. The water held secrets. The HOA held power. And soon, both were going to collide in ways no one in this community was prepared for. The county inspectors left that morning with their coolers full of water samples, their notepads crammed with observations, and polite smiles pasted on their faces. To anyone else, it looked routine. Just another government checklist, another day of bureaucratic formality. But for me, the tremor beneath the surface was undeniable. Something had shifted. The HOA president knew it too. I could see it in her body language as the inspectors drove away. Normally, she carried herself like royalty in her little kingdom. Head high, shoulders back, lips pursed in the smug confidence of a woman who believed the world answered to her clipboard. That day, though, there was a stiffness in her movements, a tension she couldn't quite mask. She hurried the other board members inside the clubhouse for a closed session, shutting the door like a general. Rallying troops after a breach in the wall, I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. The panic was written across their faces. What they didn't realize, however, was that panic spreads faster than poison. By trying to contain the problem, they were only feeding the rumor mill. And in a neighborhood like ours, where fences were low, porches were wide, and whispers traveled faster than the evening breeze, that rumor mill was relentless. Within days, the questions started flying. Parents wanted to know if it was safe to let their kids swim in the lake. Gardeners asked if they should water their plants with tap water or risk bottled. A group of retirees, the unofficial gossip circle of the neighborhood, began holding court outside the post boxes, speculating in hushed but urgent tones. The HOA board tried to smother the flames with carefully worded emails. "The water supply remains fully safe and compliant," they wrote. "Any concerns about discoloration or odor are being addressed by routine maintenance measures." But the residents weren't buying it. Too many stomach bugs, too many pets falling ill, too many fish floating belly up for anyone to believe the narrative. And when one of the inspectors returned, discreetly a week later to take additional samples, this time without announcing it to the board, The cracks in the HOA's wall widened further. Watch that inspector from my dock. He wasn't dressed in his formal uniform this time, just khakis and a county windbreaker, moving quickly and quietly. He dipped his vials into the water, scribbled notes, and left without a word. That was when I knew the story had moved beyond me. It was no longer just a fight between one man and an HOA board desperate to control him. It was the lake itself turning against them and the government taking notice. Still, I kept my role hidden. Outwardly, I remained the same quiet neighbor, tending my garden, mending my dock, waving politely when board members passed. Inwardly, though, my binder grew heavier. By now it contained not just my photos and notes, but copies of every email the HOA had sent, every notice they had posted, every contradictory statement they had made, because I knew what was coming next. When power feels threatened, it doesn't retreat. It lashes out. And lash out they did. The first strike came in the form of fines. My mailbox, already non-compliant, now apparently violated 3 separate subsections of HOA guidelines. My fence was too weathered. My lawn was overgrown. Each fine came with a deadline and the threat of legal action. They weren't subtle anymore. They wanted me to feel the pressure, to buckle under the weight of constant harassment. The second strike was more insidious. My trash bins, left at the curb overnight like always, disappeared one morning. A neighbor found them dumped in a ditch half a mile away. Another day, my dock rope was mysteriously cut, leaving my small rowboat drifting loose until it bumped against the reeds. Small acts of sabotage meant to frustrate and intimidate, but the third strike was the one that revealed their true desperation. At the next board meeting, the president unveiled a new motion, restricting fishing altogether for the health and safety of the community. She framed it as temporary, a precaution until the county completed its review. But the smirk in her eyes told a different story. This wasn't about safety. It was about erasing me. Fishing had been my voice, my visible act of defiance, the symbol of my connection to the lake. By stripping that away, she thought she could silence me once and for all. The vote passed, of course. Her loyal board members nodded like marionettes, strings pulled tight. But what they hadn't accounted for was the audience. That night, the clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Residents crammed the chairs, lined the walls, even stood by the windows outside listening. And when the motion passed, a ripple of unease spread through them like a wave. It was one thing to fine me for my lawn. It was another to ban fishing on a lake that had been the heart of this community for generations. That unease soon turned to anger. The following weekend, I wasn't the only one at the dock. Families showed up with poles and bait buckets, kids dangling lines into the murky water, grandfathers casting with the patience of decades. It was quiet rebellion, subtle but powerful. Every splash of a lure was a declaration. This lake belongs to us, not to a board with poisoned hands. I stood among them, not as a leader, but as a neighbor, feeling the tide shift. The HOA president's control was slipping. Every heavy-handed tactic she used only pushed more people to my side, and then the county results came back. I'll never forget the expression on her face when the letter arrived. She had been strutting across the clubhouse lawn, clipboard tucked like a scepter under her arm, when the mail carrier handed her the envelope. I was watching from my porch. She tore it open, scanned the page, and her posture collapsed. Shoulders sagged, jaw tightened. Even from a distance, I could see the sweat bead on her forehead. Word spread fast. The county had found elevated levels of copper, nitrates, and a cocktail of herbicides in both the lake and the tap water drawn from it. While they stopped short of declaring the water unsafe for immediate use, they mandated additional testing, treatment, and a full investigation into the source of contamination. It was the beginning of the end. The residents erupted. The gossip circle at the mailboxes turned into open outrage. Parents demanded emergency meetings. People started calling the county directly, bypassing the board altogether. The HOA's carefully constructed image of control was unraveling faster than they could patch it. And for me, the binder in my study was no longer just evidence. It was dynamite. With every passing day, with every new whisper and rumor, the fuse crept closer to the explosion. The HOA had poisoned the water to silence one fisherman. Now the water itself was about to drown them in consequences, and deep down, I knew I wasn't going to need to cast a single line to finish this fight. The lake would do it for me. The county's findings didn't just rattle the HOA, they ignited the community. For years, people had tolerated the board's arrogance because it was easier to grumble than to fight. But when the water, the very lifeblood of the neighborhood, was revealed to be tainted, patience ran dry. No carefully worded email or glossy newsletter could disguise what residents were living with daily: foul-tasting taps, sick pets, and a lake that smelled more like bleach than fresh water. It started with small acts of defiance. The parents who once avoided conflict began showing up at the clubhouse demanding explanations. The retirees who gossiped at the mailbox now spoke loudly, directly confronting board members during their evening walks. I noticed neighbors, people who once barely waved to one another, begin to gather in clusters, trading information and suspicions. The HOA's walls of secrecy had been punctured, and the truth was leaking out in every direction. I remained careful, though I was tempted to step forward with my binder to reveal the mountain of evidence I'd collected. I held back. Timing mattered more than glory. Right now, the community's anger was growing naturally, without me needing to push it. If I moved too early, the HOA could still twist the narrative, brand me as the troublemaker, the agitator, the reason everyone was panicking. Instead, I listened. I documented. I made myself available to neighbors who wanted to talk, offering sympathetic nods and cautious remarks. Yes, I've noticed the water smells strange too. I heard the county's still investigating. It's hard to know what to trust these days. I was planting seeds, nothing more. Seeds that would bloom when the time was right. The HOA, on the other hand, responded with predictable aggression. A fresh wave of violation notices rained down on the neighborhood. Grass too long. Decorative flags not approved. Trash bins left visible. It was obvious harassment disguised as community upkeep, but the tactic backfired. Instead of intimidating residents, it enraged them further. People compared fines, photographed notices, and began sharing them in a private online group someone had set up. Within a week, half the neighborhood was in that group, trading stories of HOA bullying. And then, the board made their fatal mistake. At an emergency meeting called to address water concerns, the HOA president stood at the front of the clubhouse, her clipboard like a shield. She wore her usual smug expression, but I could see the cracks beneath it. Her eyes darted nervously across the crowd, which was larger and angrier than any meeting before. "We want to reassure everyone," she began, "that the water supply remains safe. The discoloration and odor are the result of natural algae blooms, nothing more. The county's findings were preliminary and exaggerated. As your board, we are handling this responsibly." Her words were met with mutters, then open scoffs. People weren't buying it anymore. A mother in the back stood and shouted, "My son's been sick for weeks." "Don't you dare tell me it's just algae!" An older man added, "I've lived here 20 years. I know what algae smells like. This is chemicals." The president tried to maintain control, but the room was slipping away from her. She raised her voice, attempted to shame the crowd into silence. "Spreading fear will not help this community. We must stand together," but her appeal fell flat. One by one, residents stood, voices overlapping, demanding answers. It wasn't anger at one man anymore. It was collective fury. I watched quietly from my seat in the back, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment when the board's grip fractured beyond repair. They had poisoned the lake to target me, but now the whole community was awake, and they weren't going back to sleep. Desperation makes people reckless, and that night, the board proved just how reckless they were willing to become. Within days of that disastrous meeting, the HOA rolled out a new temporary measure. They claimed the lake needed treatment to protect property values and arranged for contractors to stabilize the water quality. To the untrained eye, it sounded responsible, but I knew better. Treatment was their code word for more chemicals. Sure enough, trucks arrived one morning hauling fresh barrels identical to the ones I had photographed in the maintenance shed. The contractors wore gloves and masks, handling the barrels with the kind of caution that screamed danger. They dumped the contents into the lake under the board's supervision, all while residents watched from their porches with folded arms and narrowed eyes. The effect was immediate. The already sickly green water foamed at the edges. Fish surfaced, gasping, before floating lifeless in clusters. The air filled with a sharp metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. It was an assault on the senses, undeniable proof that the board wasn't fixing the problem. They were making it worse. That night, the private online group exploded with outrage. Photos of dead fish, videos of contractors pouring barrels, personal testimonies of rashes and nausea. The HOA president tried to issue another email calling it necessary maintenance, but no one was fooled anymore. The tide had turned completely, and then something remarkable happened. The community, long fractured by fear and indifference, began to organize. Neighbors met in garages and living rooms, away from the watchful eyes of the board. They drafted petitions, demanded an independent investigation, and began pooling money for legal counsel. The HOA had tried to divide and intimidate us, but instead, they had united us. For me, it was a vindication. Years of quiet documentation, of being painted as the cranky fishermen who didn't fit in, were paying off. The lake had always been more than water to me. It was a lifeline, a heritage, a sanctuary. Now it was the rallying point for the entire neighborhood. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA was cornered, and cornered animals lash out hardest. The president, in particular, wasn't the type to admit defeat. She thrived on control, on power. Losing it would be unbearable for her, and I was right. Late one evening, as I returned from a walk along the lake, I found a letter shoved under my door. No official letterhead this time. No signature. Just a single sheet of paper with words scrawled in black ink. Stop this now or you'll regret it. For the first time since this battle began, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a violation notice or a fine. This was a threat, raw and personal. But instead of fear, it filled me with resolve. Because threats are the last refuge of the desperate. It meant they knew they were losing. And when people like that are losing, the truth isn't far behind. I sat at my kitchen table that night, binder open before me. The anonymous letter resting on top, like the final piece of the puzzle. Around me, the house was quiet, but outside, the lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Poisoned, yes. Dying, yes. But also alive, still reflecting the sky, still holding its secrets. The HOA had tried to own it, control it, destroy it. But they had forgotten one simple fact. Water cannot be controlled forever. It finds cracks, seeps through barriers, erodes even the strongest walls, and soon it was going to wash them away. The anonymous threat shoved under my door was the HOA's final card, a last-ditch attempt to scare me into silence. But by then, fear had long left me. I had faced their fines, their harassment, their sabotage, and their poison. They had turned neighbors against me, only to watch those same neighbors wake up and unite. The letter wasn't power, it was weakness bleeding through ink. I added it to the binder. That collection of photos, notices, test results, and transcripts had become something larger than I ever imagined. It wasn't just my shield anymore. It was a weapon. And soon, it would strike. The county investigation had already revealed dangerous levels of copper, nitrates, and herbicides, but their follow-up tests were worse. The second report, released 3 weeks after the first, confirmed what we all knew in our bones. The water wasn't just compromised, it was hazardous. Levels of contaminants far exceeded safe limits. Long-term exposure could cause severe health issues. The county mandated immediate action, demanded remediation, and most importantly, launched a probe into the source of the pollution. That probe led straight to the HOA. The contractors who had dumped barrels into the lake were questioned. Paper trails were traced back to invoices approved by the board. The maintenance shed, long their little secret, was opened and cataloged. Inside, inspectors found stacks of chemical drums, some leaking, others labeled with skull and crossbones warnings. Photographs of that discovery made their way into the county's files, and inevitably, onto residents' phones. The HOA board tried to spin it. They claimed the chemicals were routine lake management. They argued that the contamination came from runoff outside their control. They even attempted to blame residents, saying improper lawn treatments had leached into the water. But the evidence was undeniable. The labels, the receipts, the witness statements, it all pointed one way, and when the county scheduled a public hearing, the tide truly turned. The community hall was packed that evening. Folding chairs overflowed with residents, reporters, even curious outsiders drawn by whispers of scandal. At the front sat the HOA board, pale and stiff, their usual arrogance stripped bare. The president still held her clipboard, but it trembled in her hands. One by one, inspectors presented their findings. Photos of dead fish, charts of rising toxin levels, testimonies from families whose children had suffered stomach illnesses. The facts piled up like waves crashing against a seawall, relentless and unyielding. When it was my turn to speak, I carried the binder to the podium. My voice was steady, calm, but every word landed like a stone. I spoke of the fish kills I had witnessed, the suspicious activity at the shed, the intimidation tactics, the violation notices. I showed them the photographs of contractors unloading barrels under the cover of night. I held up the anonymous threat and let its ugliness speak for itself. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Not the silence of disbelief, but the heavy, collective silence of people realizing they had been lied to, poisoned, and used. Then the silence broke. Anger erupted from every corner. Parents shouting, retirees demanding resignations, neighbors who had once stayed quiet now raising their voices with fury. The county officials struggled to maintain order. But the message was clear. The community no longer recognized the authority of its board. That night marked the end of the HOA as we had known it. Within days, the president resigned under pressure, though she tried to frame it as stepping aside for the good of the community. The rest of the board followed soon after, unable to withstand the storm of outrage. Investigations continued, and rumors swirled of lawsuits and criminal charges. The once feared HOA was now just a broken shell, abandoned by the very people it had claimed to represent. And the lake? The county began an aggressive cleanup effort. Aeration systems were installed. Contaminated sediment was dredged. Water treatment facilities ramped up operations. It would take years to undo the damage fully, but the process had begun. The poison that had been poured so carelessly into our water was being washed away, piece by piece. I returned to my dock one quiet morning not long after the hearing. The air still carried a faint metallic tang, but the water looked clearer than it had in months. I cast a line into the lake, not expecting to catch much, but simply to feel the tug of the line, the ripple of the surface, the connection to something greater than myself. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Turning, I saw neighbors approaching, families, retirees, even the young father who once confided in me about buying bottled water. They carried rods and tackle boxes, their faces lighter than I had seen in a long time. Without a word, they joined me at the water's edge. Lures splashed, bobbers drifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, laughter echoed across the lake. We weren't just fishing. We were reclaiming what had always been ours. The HOA had tried to poison the lake to control one man. In the end, they had poisoned their own authority, their own reputation, their own future. And the lake, scarred but resilient, had been the instrument of their downfall. I sat on the dock, binder beside me, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The fight had been long, bitter, and exhausting, but it was worth every moment. Because in the end, the truth had floated to the surface, just like the fish that once revealed the board's crimes. The water had spoken, and we had listened. And if you've come this far with me, I want to thank you. Stories like this remind us that standing up to corruption, no matter how small it seems, matters. If you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because every story deserves to be heard, and every voice deserves to ripple outward like waves across the water.